On April 5, 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 61-2, an order that made it illegal for Americans to own gold. Citizens were given 30 days to turn in their gold to the Federal Reserve or face a $10,000 fine and up to 10 years in prison. 10 years behind bars simply for owning gold. Most Americans obeyed. They walked into banks and surrendered their gold coins, bars, and gold certificates. In return, the government paid them the fixed official price of $20.67 per ounce, a number that had not changed since 1879. People trusted their government. They believed the policy was temporary. They believed they were helping the nation recover from the Great Depression. Then everything changed. 9 months later, after the government had collected the majority of the nation's gold, Roosevelt revalued gold to $35 per ounce, an overnight increase of 69%. With one stroke of a pen, the government legally captured roughly 40% of America's private wealth. Owning gold was now a crime, and the revaluation was irreversible. There was nothing citizens could do. This is not ancient history. It is a blueprint, one that is being reused in 2025 with different assets, different language, but identical mechanics. Let me show you the evidence. On January 23, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The wording mirrors Executive Order 6102 almost exactly. Strategic Asset National Security Mandatory Acquisition Authority. This order is not about crypto innovation. It is not about digital leadership. It is the legal foundation for confiscation. The setup for forced acquisition, revaluation, and debt erasure, this time targeting not only gold, but Bitcoin, crypto, and any hard asset outside government control. In this video, I'm going to show how Executive Order 61-2 worked, why the playbook is repeating, what the government is doing right now to prepare for confiscation, and how you can protect yourself before it is too late. Because once confiscation begins, once revaluation is executed, there is no going back. You'll either be positioned to survive, or you'll lose everything. Let's start with what actually happened in 1933, because the details reveal the pattern. America was deep in the Great Depression. Unemployment was 25%. Thousands of banks were collapsing. The economy was spiraling downward, and the government was drowning in World War I debt. Debt to GDP was 40% and rising. That number sounds small compared to today's 2%, but in 1933 the dollar was backed by gold. Every dollar had to be redeemable for gold at $20.67 an ounce. This created a deadly problem. As the Depression worsened, people lost trust in banks. They withdrew their deposits and demanded gold, not paper dollars, because they feared paper money would lose value. This triggered a massive run on the Federal Reserve's gold reserves. Under the gold standard, the Fed could not print more dollars unless it had more gold. The money supply contracted, causing brutal deflation. Prices fell, wages fell, and debts became harder to repay because the dollar's purchasing power kept rising. The entire system was collapsing. Roosevelt needed to break the gold standard. He needed to print money without gold backing. But abandoning the gold standard outright would trigger panic, so he did something far more strategic. He confiscated the gold first. Executive Order 6102 required all Americans to deliver their gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1, 1933. There were small exceptions: 5 ounces for personal use, gold for jewelers, gold for dentists. But ordinary citizens had no exemption. The penalties were extreme: a $10,000 fines, about $230,000 today, and up to 10 years in prison. The message was clear. The government wanted the gold, and they would get it. Most Americans complied. They trusted the government. They believed it was temporary. They had no idea what was coming. After the May 1 deadline, the government waited. 9 months later, in January 1934, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act. It transferred all Federal Reserve gold to the Treasury and authorized the president to revalue gold. Roosevelt raised the official price to $35 per ounce, a 69% jump. The Treasury now controlled around 195 million ounces of gold. At the old price, this was worth $4 billion. At the new price, it was worth $6.8 billion. Overnight, through accounting manipulation, the government created $2.8 billion in new value, an amount equal to nearly half of the entire federal budget at the time. But the real purpose was debt reduction. Because the dollar was now worth 40% less relative to gold, the real value of government debt dropped by roughly 40% overnight. The government erased nearly half its debt by confiscating and revaluing gold. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens who surrendered their gold lost nearly half their wealth, and inflation destroyed even more in the years that followed. This was not a side effect, it was the plan. Confiscate, revalue, erase the debt, transfer wealth from citizens to the government. It worked flawlessly, and it's happening again. Today the US owes $37 trillion. Debt to GDP is 132%. Interest payments are $1.2 trillion per year, higher than Medicare, higher than defense. At current rates, interest payments will hit $1.8 trillion by 2027. The debt cannot be paid through taxes, growth, or spending cuts. There is only one option left, Roosevelt's option: confiscation and revaluation. But this time they want everything: Bitcoin, crypto, gold, hard assets. Trump's executive order declaring Bitcoin a strategic asset mirrors the language of Executive Order 6112Z. Strategic Asset, National Security Acquisition Authority. This lays the legal foundation for confiscation. Phase 1 is complete. Phase 2 is voluntary acquisition. The government begins accumulating Bitcoin quietly, through seizures, tax payments, and mining using federal energy infrastructure. Meanwhile, they build a tracking system far more powerful than anything in 1933. Back then, gold was physical. You could hide it. Today, crypto is digital and exchanges require KYC. Coinbase has your data. Kraken has your data. The IRS has every transaction tied to your identity. They know exactly who owns what. Phase 3 is mandatory acquisition. The government will announce that all Bitcoin holdings above a certain threshold, maybe 1 Bitcoin, maybe 10, must be sold to the Treasury at an official price. That price will be below market, just like 1933. Penalties for non-compliance will be severe. And because they have databases, most people will comply. Phase 4 is revaluation. After the government accumulates enough Bitcoin, perhaps 1 million coins, they will revalue it, maybe to 500,000, maybe to $1 million per coin. This instantly injects trillions into the federal balance sheet and erases the debt burden. But it also destroys the dollar. If Bitcoin goes from 100,000 to 1 million, the dollar loses 90% of its value relative to Bitcoin. Inflation explodes. Food, energy, housing become unaffordable. The middle class is wiped out. 2025 is the accumulation phase. 2026 is the crisis phase. 2027 is confiscation and revaluation. 2028 becomes the new monetary normal. The cycle repeats. The government survives. Citizens lose. Now let me show you how to protect yourself. They can confiscate crypto on exchanges. They can seize ETF Bitcoin. But they cannot easily confiscate self-custodied, non-KYC Bitcoin held on hardware wallets. If you want to protect yourself, withdraw everything from exchanges. Move assets into self-custody. Acquire non-KYC Bitcoin where legal. Avoid ETFs. Store physical gold privately. Consider global diversification. In 1933, most people complied and lost everything. A small minority did not comply. They hid their gold, kept it buried, and preserved their wealth while compliant Americans were wiped out. The playbook is repeating. The mechanism is the same. Only the asset has changed. The question is whether you will repeat history or learn from it. China's massive accumulation of US dollars has evolved into a strategic vulnerability because what began as an advantage for fueling rapid industrial growth eventually created a structural dependency that now limits China's economic maneuverability. For decades, China relied on exporting vast quantities of goods to the United States, receiving dollars in return, and reinvesting those dollars into U.S. Treasury bonds to keep its own currency stable and competitive. This cycle worked flawlessly during the era of globalization, when China was rising as the world's factory. But over time, the sheer volume of dollar reserves reached a point where China no longer just held dollars as a financial asset. It became locked into the American financial system in ways that restrict its strategic choices. Each dollar China holds is also a piece of leverage the United States indirectly controls, because those dollars only retain value and usability through the very system America dominates. This creates a paradox where China's economic power is tied to the currency of its greatest strategic rival, making the country both strong and fragile at the same time. What makes this dependency even more complicated is the fact that China cannot easily reduce its holdings without hurting itself. Selling off U.S. Treasury bonds in large amounts would devalue the remaining bonds China still owns and could destabilize global markets. triggering outcomes far worse for China's own economy. The trap here is that China possesses too many dollars to exit the system quickly, and too few alternatives that offer the same liquidity and global acceptance. This forces China to continue participating in a system that gives the United States significant influence over its financial stability. This is not only a monetary issue, but a geopolitical one, because China's long-term strategic ambitions require financial independence. Yet financial independence becomes nearly impossible, while its reserves are still dollar-heavy. Furthermore, the dollar trap affects China's domestic policy-making. China must maintain certain levels of dollar reserves to defend its currency during market fluctuations, meaning it cannot fully liberalize its financial markets or allow the yuan to float freely without risking instability. This inability to move quickly toward a more flexible currency is a constraint that slows China's transition from an export-driven economy to a consumption-driven one. The dependency also narrows China's options during times of global tension, because aggressive moves against the United States could trigger financial responses that directly weaken China's dollar reserves or disrupt trade flows that feed those reserves. As a result, China must constantly balance its geopolitical objectives with the reality that its financial system is deeply tied to the US dollar ecosystem. At the same time, the dollar trap shapes China's foreign policy decisions by limiting how openly it can challenge American dominance. Every sanction, trade restriction, or diplomatic conflict with the United States carries the risk of financial repercussions that ripple through China's dollar-dependent economy. This means China must proceed with caution even when pursuing policies that align with its long-term national interests. The more China expands globally, the more it needs a stable financial foundation, but that foundation still rests largely on a currency controlled by a competitor. This imbalance creates constant strategic tension, where China wants to accelerate its rise, while knowing that the financial world it relies on is not fully its own making. The dollar trap ultimately represents a structural vulnerability created by decades of global economic integration. China is powerful because it embraced the dollar-dominant system, yet constrained because it became too deeply embedded in it. Its vast reserves, once symbols of economic strength, now function like chains that make rapid strategic shifts risky and potentially self-destructive. This tension between power and dependency is the core of China's financial vulnerability and a defining feature of its relationship with the United States. The global dependency on the US dollar allows America to influence China's financial stability and restrict its geopolitical ambitions, because the dollar is not just a currency, but the central nervous system of international trade, banking, and capital markets. Nearly every major economy relies on the dollar for foreign reserves, cross-border settlements, commodity pricing, and global investment, creating a structure where the United States sits at the center of financial gravity. In this system, China, despite its economic size, cannot detach itself without facing significant disruptions in trade and liquidity. When most global transactions, from oil to technology components, are priced in dollars, China must hold and use dollars to continue participating in global commerce. This creates a dynamic where the United States has disproportionate sway over global financial conditions, and by extension, over how stable other economies remain, including the Chinese economy that depends on predictable access to dollar networks. This interconnected system gives the United States a unique form of leverage known as financial power projection, where policy decisions made in Washington can reverberate across global markets, impacting interest rates, borrowing costs, exchange rates, and capital flows worldwide. When the Federal Reserve raises or lowers rates, the consequences ripple across Asia, Europe, and emerging markets, shifting the value of the dollar and altering the financial health of countries tied to it. China, with its vast holdings of U.S. treasuries and heavy reliance on dollar-denominated trade, cannot insulate itself from these shifts. American financial institutions, international payment networks, and regulatory systems indirectly shape the environment in which China operates. Even sanctions imposed on other nations create precedents that remind China how much influence America wields over the global financial infrastructure. This influence extends into geopolitical strategy, where the United States can use dollar dominance to exert pressure without physical confrontation. By controlling access to systems like SGUIFT, correspondent banking, and dollar clearing networks, the United States holds tools that can limit a nation's ability to transact globally. While China has built alternatives like CPS and promoted the yuan in cross-border trade, these systems remain small compared to dollar-based institutions. The fear of potential financial isolation restrains China from taking actions that could provoke the United States, such as openly supporting sanctioned states, moving too aggressively in disputed regions, or challenging American interests in global bodies. Even if China is not directly threatened, the possibility of dollar-based disruptions forces it to calculate every geopolitical move with caution, understanding that financial stability is tightly linked to American-controlled mechanisms. China's ambition to rise as a rival global power requires economic autonomy and the ability to project influence abroad, but its reliance on the dollar makes such ambitions difficult to fully realize. Countries that trade with China often still demand settlement in dollars because they trust the dollar's stability more than the yuan's. Global investors prefer U.S. financial assets because they are liquid and backed by an established legal system. Multinational corporations hold their reserves in dollars to reduce risk. This ecosystem strengthens the United States' position and weakens China's ability to reshape global financial norms. As long as the dollar remains the dominant reserve currency, China's efforts to build a parallel system will be slow and complicated, creating constant friction between what China seeks to achieve and what the global financial structure permits. The power imbalance becomes clearer during periods of tension, when even small American regulatory changes or policy shifts can affect China's currency value, capital flows, and export competitiveness. China cannot easily respond because any aggressive move risks destabilizing its own dollar-exposed economy. This makes China's geopolitical strategies more cautious and reactive, as it must prioritize economic stability while navigating a financial environment where the United States holds the central position. The dependency creates a strategic limitation. China can grow strong within the dollar system, but challenging that system comes with significant costs. Shaping a world where the United States maintains financial primacy, while China navigates constraints built into the very structure of global finance. China's attempt to diversify away from the dollar through gold reserves, currency swaps, and broader de-dollarization strategies is slow and complicated, creating internal economic pressure because the global financial architecture is still overwhelmingly dependent on the U.S. currency. As China recognizes the risks of holding trillions in dollar assets, it has pushed aggressively to accumulate gold, expand the use of the yuan in international trade, and sign bilateral agreements that bypass the dollar. However, these initiatives face structural barriers that make rapid transition impossible. Gold accumulation, while helpful as a hedge, does not provide the liquidity or global acceptance that China needs for everyday trade and financial operations. Gold cannot substitute for the dollar's role in global lending, pricing, settlement, or reserves at the scale China requires. So even as China becomes the world's largest buyer of gold, the shift only reduces risk at the margins, rather than freeing the country from its dollar dependence. China has also expanded its network of currency swap lines through the People's Bank of China, signing agreements with dozens of countries that allow them to settle trade in yuan instead of dollars. While this increases the yuan's presence globally, most participating nations still prefer the dollar for long-term reserves and high-value transactions due to the stability, liquidity, and legal protections of U.S. financial markets. The yuan, by contrast, remains limited by capital controls and a lack of trust in China's regulatory transparency, preventing it from operating as a true global reserve currency. Even China's closest trade partners often use the yuan for only a small portion of transactions, reverting to the dollar for major settlements. This gap reveals that China can promote the yuan politically, but cannot force global markets to adopt it at the scale required to replace the dollar. De-dollarization also creates tension within China's domestic economy, because the country relies heavily on export-driven growth, and global commodities such as oil, metals, and agricultural products are still priced in dollars. To function efficiently, Chinese companies need stable access to dollar liquidity. Efforts to replace the dollar in commodity trading have moved slowly because major producers and financial institutions continue to trust U.S. systems more than alternatives. China's attempts to launch yuan-based commodity contracts have had limited international uptake, showing that the infrastructure for global adoption is still underdeveloped. Meanwhile, any aggressive attempt to force rapid de-dollarization could disrupt supply chains, raise import costs, and create inflation within China, leading to internal instability that the government seeks to avoid. Another challenge is that China's financial system is not fully liberalized, making global investors hesitant to hold large amounts of yuan assets. Capital controls restrict the free movement of money in and out of China, undermining confidence in the currency's long-term reliability. Without open capital markets and a legal environment perceived as independent and transparent, global financial institutions cannot treat the yuan as interchangeable with the dollar. This creates a paradox for China. True de-dollarization requires reforms that could introduce volatility and diminish centralized control, but maintaining control slows the yuan's global acceptance. As a result, China is stuck between its desire for global financial independence and the realities of its internal political and economic structure. The slow pace of de-dollarization puts pressure on China's long-term strategy because each step away from the dollar exposes weaknesses in its financial architecture. Gold can hedge but not replace liquidity. Currency swaps can support bilateral trade, but not global finance. And yuan internationalization can grow only gradually without risking domestic instability. This creates an environment where China must proceed cautiously, knowing that moving too quickly could damage its economy, while moving too slowly leaves it vulnerable to U.S. financial power. The tension between ambition and capability defines China's de-dollarization journey, revealing a long and complex path where progress is real but constrained by structural limitations China cannot easily overcome.